I am 83 years old now, and the mirror shows exactly what 83 years of slow, relentless life does to a woman. My hands are gnarled, my hair is thin as winter lace, and the deep lines around my eyes hold too many silent memories. But the truest, heaviest weight I carry is the name they gave me. They call me Eliana. It is a beautiful name full of high, ancient syllables. But it is not mine. It never was. Eliana means the pillar of the house, and with that name came the duty, a heavy, suffocating mandate that dictated every single choice I was allowed to make from the moment I drew my first breath. I never knew my real name. I only knew the one they assigned me, and the obligation that came with it. The duty was simple and absolutely unforgiving. Marry the one who would expand the family's land, bear him 3 sons, and silence all personal desires. It was a chain forged in tradition, and every firstborn daughter in our line, my grandmother, my mother, and then me, wore it without question. I was raised as a fine, polished instrument designed not for my own joy, but for the precise purpose of family expansion. My opinions were trained out of me. My dreams were filed down until they were smooth, dull, and easy to ignore. The real trauma of my life was not a single sharp event, but a slow, decades-long erosion of self. My mother, a severe and silent woman, fulfilled her duty with chilling perfection. I remember her standing over me as a girl, teaching me the rigid needlework patterns of our house crest, her eyes empty, her voice flat. "A woman's greatest strength, Eliana," she used to say, her voice barely a whisper, "is her capacity for stillness. Never want what you cannot have." What I could not have was myself. I was simply the current iteration of the pillar, a vessel for the family's relentless, unyielding future. The moment my own daughter was born, the firstborn in the next generation, my mother looked at me not with love, but with the cold, critical assessment of a manager appraising the next link in the chain. I was 22 when I met Thomas. He was the man chosen for me, sturdy, successful, and heir to the largest vineyard bordering our land. The marriage was a cold, precise business merger in the guise of a ceremony. But before Thomas, there was Gabriel, who worked in the town library, who smelled of old paper and fresh air, and who called me Lilia because he said my laughter sounded like a soft bell. Lilia. It was the first time I heard a name that felt like my own. It felt like a small, forbidden window opening in the rigid walls of my life. I met him secretly for 6 desperate months, reading banned poetry and imagining a life where the duty was just a faded word in a dictionary. The night before my wedding, Gabriel pressed a small, smooth, river-worn stone into my palm. "When you feel you are drowning, Eliana," he whispered, his eyes full of pain, "hold this. Remember Lilia. She is the real one." I never saw him again. He left the town the day of the wedding, unable to stay and watch the pillar fulfill its purpose. I held that stone throughout the entire wedding ceremony, the cold pressure of it the only thing that kept me from shattering into a million pieces. That stone, hidden deep in the lining of my dress, became the silent seed of my rebellion. My marriage to Thomas was precisely what tradition demanded, structured, productive, and utterly loveless. I bore him 3 strong sons, fulfilled my house duties with impeccable perfection, and became the very image of the unshakable pillar. But every night, before I slept, I would reach under the mattress and touch the river stone. I would whisper the forbidden name, Lilia. Lilia was my secret, unsown identity. Lilia was the woman who read poetry and laughed freely. Eliana was the woman who served the family name. The daily act of being Eliana was the trauma. The nightly remembrance of Lilia was the only thing that kept the true self alive. The rebellion began slowly, quietly, in the only place I still claimed as my own, the massive family quilt I was required to perpetually mend. Every stitch had to be perfect, mirroring the formal patterns of the family crest. But I began to hide a single, invisible act of defiance within the vast, monotonous fabric. In the deepest, most complex section, where the geometric patterns met, I began to stitch a new name, not the name they gave me, and not even the name Gabriel gave me. I began to stitch the name I would have chosen for myself, Isolde. Isolde! It meant fair ruler, a name of strength and independence, a complete contradiction to the submissive duty I was born to serve. I stitched it using threads pulled from the inside lining of old garments, colors so close to the quilt's existing shades that the name was utterly invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look and what the light was like. It was a secret language spoken only between my hands and the fabric, a silent declaration of war against the ancient tradition that bound me. The act of stitching that forbidden name was the first time in my life I felt truly sovereign. Years passed, turning into decades. Thomas aged, the vineyards prospered, and I became the respected matriarch, the perfectly unblemished pillar they all adored. But beneath the surface, the rebellion grew. Every year I would add a few more stitches to the invisible name, reinforcing Isolde's existence within the foundation of the house. It was a slow, agonizing process, often interrupted by the demands of the duty, hosting parties, managing staff, and training my own daughter to accept the same suffocating mantle. I watched my daughter, who they named Serafina, the one who shines, begin her own slow submission, her eyes already holding that familiar, distant sadness. The greatest test of my resolve came when my mother died. As the pillar, I was expected to bear the grief with public stoicism. I performed the rituals flawlessly, controlled sorrow. But later, alone with the massive family quilt, I found her secret. Tucked deep into a corner of the fabric, hidden beneath a patch I had never noticed, was a single tiny, almost invisible, embroidered rose. It was the only non-geometric pattern on the entire quilt. I instantly knew. My mother, the woman of stillness and severe silence, had also enacted her own hidden rebellion against the name and the duty. Her tiny embroidered rose was the first confirmation that I was not alone in my silent prison. It was a secret passed not through words, but through the deliberate, hidden language of needlework. I cried that night, not for the first time, but for the first time for her, for the profound, crushing loneliness she must have endured, convinced she was the only one who had ever dared to want something more. The trauma wasn't just my own, it was a generational shared wound, covered over by the perfect, impenetrable fabric of tradition. That night, I dedicated my life to finishing the invisible name, not just for myself, but for the ghost of my mother, and for the hope of my daughter. The years of my 70s were spent waiting for the final, necessary moment to break the chain. The quilt was finished, the name Isolde woven deep into its core, utterly invisible to the untrained eye, yet intensely real to me. My daughter Serafina was now 55, a pillar in her own right, raising her own firstborn daughter, Clara. I looked at Clara, my granddaughter, and saw a vibrant, modern young woman, restless and full of dreams, a woman tradition would surely crush. I knew I could not let the duty pass to her. The rebellion had to finally become visible. I finally understood my mother's silence. The chain could only be broken by the current pillar at the very moment she released her own successor. She couldn't break it early, or the shock would destroy the entire family structure, causing chaos she couldn't risk. My time had come. Clara was turning 21, the age I was when Gabriel gave me the Riverstone. I called my granddaughter into my small, silent sitting room, where the massive, ancient quilt lay draped over the mahogany table. I was 83, and I was finally ready to speak my true name. Clara, I said, my voice surprisingly steady, the old, practiced Eliana voice. I have something to show you about the family history. A history that isn't written in the books. I pulled out the Riverstone, still smooth and cold, and the small, leather-bound diary I had kept hidden for 60 years, detailing every moment of my life as Lilia and every stitch of my rebellion as Isolde. I told her the story of the duty, the story of my mother's secret rose, and the slow, internal trauma of wearing a name that was not my own. Clara listened, her eyes wide, understanding the heavy, invisible burden of her lineage for the very first time. Finally, I led her to the massive quilt. I held her hand and guided her fingers to the tiny, specific patch where the threads of my invisible defiance lay hidden. I tilted the room's lamp at a precise angle, and there, barely visible against the backdrop of the family crest, the name Isolde seemed to glow. For 70 years, Clara, I was Eliana, but I am Isolde, I whispered, the relief making my voice tremble. The duty ends with me. I want you to choose your own name and wear it with fierce, uncompromising joy. It was not a noisy, dramatic overthrow, but a quiet, final act of profound liberation passed down through the hands of a woman who had finally reclaimed her entire life. Clara didn't speak for a long time. She simply stood there, tracing the barely visible threads of the name Isolde with a reverent fingertip. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright, not with surprise, but with a deep, immediate understanding of the immense sacrifice that name represented. "Grandmother," she finally said, her voice shaking slightly, "you lived your whole life under house arrest." She didn't pity me, she saw me. She saw the true cost of the duty, the decades of suppressed laughter, unread poems, and unchosen paths, all hidden beneath a perfect veneer of compliance. She immediately understood the meaning of the river stone, the diary, and the profound, silent communication hidden within the very fabric of our family's history. The revelation of my secret name, Isolde, and the declaration that the duty was dead caused an immediate, intense earthquake in the quiet structure of the family. My sons and their wives were utterly bewildered. They saw Eliana, the pillar of stoicism and traditional order, as an immutable fact. They immediately rejected the idea of the duty being a form of trauma. To them, it was the sacred, essential framework that ensured their continued prosperity and stability. They saw my act not as liberation, but as a dangerous, incomprehensible betrayal of the family name. My own daughter, Serafina, was the most torn, caught between the suffocating obedience she had internalized and the sudden blinding light of my freedom. It took Serafina several weeks before she could look at me without either immense awe or intense fear. She had lived her entire adult life believing the duty was her inevitable, necessary fate. To realize it was a choice I was now allowing her to discard was destabilizing. She finally came to me, holding the corner of the quilt. "Mother," she whispered, using the formal address, "what was her name?" I instantly knew she meant my severe, silent mother. I told Serafina about the invisible, embroidered rose, the tiny secret rebellion that gave her mother, Eliana, the strength to stitch Isolde. For the first time, I saw genuine, raw grief in Serafina's eyes. Grief for the mother she never knew, and the choices she never thought she had. My sons continued to protest, citing ancient contracts and the lineage of the house. I heard them out calmly, using the same composed, unwavering voice I had perfected as Eliana. But the content was different. The house is built on land. Yes, I told them, but the family is built on trust. And you cannot trust a structure built on a generational lie. I immediately asserted my authority, not as the pillar serving the duty, but as the matriarch who had finally reclaimed her own life. The silence I had once used to suppress my desires, I now used to enforce my freedom. Clara, meanwhile, started her own quiet, joyous transformation. She didn't instantly abandon the family name, but she began introducing herself using a different, carefully chosen middle name, a name of her own choosing that honored her own personal aspirations. She made it her signature, her email, her identity on the wider world. She immediately understood that the rebellion wasn't about chaos or grand gestures. It was about the quiet, daily insistence on self-definition. She became my constant, eager companion, helping me document the hidden history in my diary and the quilt, turning the traumatic past into a powerful, living legacy. I spent the next few months meticulously teaching Clara the difference between the duty stitch, tight, unyielding, meant to hold things in, and the rebellion stitch, loose, deliberate, meant to hold things together in a new way. The quilt became the true artifact of our trauma and our liberation. We would spend afternoons with the lamp angled just right, reviewing the subtle light that revealed Isolde, and then looking for the faint outline of my mother's rose. It was a physical, tangible way to process the decades of silent suffering and generational compliance. My health, having been rigorously maintained by the demands of the duty, began to gently fail. I accepted it with a serene calm I never could have possessed as Eliana. The fear of death had been replaced by the profound gratitude of having finally lived authentically, even if only for a few final years. I had fought the long internal war and had finally won the only battle that truly mattered, the battle for my own soul. The most profound realization came on my final birthday. Serafina, my daughter, brought me a gift. It was a new piece of fine raw linen untouched by the family crest. On it she had stitched one simple, deliberate initial, the letter I. She looked at me, her eyes clear, and said, "Happy birthday, Isolde." It was the first time in 83 years that my true name had been spoken by my own daughter, freely and without the shadow of the duty. That small, simple recognition healed the deepest wound of all. I no longer needed the river stone to remind me of Lilia. Lilia had taught me how to dream, and Isolde had taught me how to live those dreams. I placed the stone gently on my bedside table, knowing that the fear of drowning was gone forever. The quilt now rests in a museum archive, specifically requested by Clara, not as a relic of tradition, but as an artifact of female resistance, clearly labeled with the story of the hidden name and the secret rose. It is a testament to the quiet power of women who find liberation in the spaces left unseen. I still sign my official documents as Eliana, a courtesy to the established world and the continuation of the family's public name. But when I look in the mirror, I smile at Isolde, the woman who chose herself. My final act of defiance was to leave specific instructions for my own tombstone. It lists my birth date and my death date, and beneath the formal, required name Eliana, it carries one single, clear inscription: the pillar fell, Isolde rose. I close my eyes now, not with the exhaustion of carrying the duty, but with the deep, settling peace of a battle won. The trauma is a scar, a faint memory, but the truth, the powerful, liberating truth of my name, is the final, beautiful legacy I leave behind. I am 83, and my name is Isolde. It took 70 years to stitch, but the quiet rebellion finally ended the silence, and finally freed us all. Narrated by Clara, years later, Grandmother Isolde passed peacefully a few years after she revealed her name to me. Her death was not a tragedy. It was a profound release. The formal funeral observed the customs of Eliana, the pillar, but the wake was a quiet celebration of Isolde, the survivor. My mother, Serafina, led the toast, holding a glass of our strongest vintage, and for the first time spoke her own chosen middle name aloud. The tombstone was erected exactly as Isolde had planned. The family initially argued. My uncles found the inscription "The pillar fell." Isolde rose highly inappropriate and disruptive. But Serafina, wielding the quiet authority she inherited from her mother's final act, firmly insisted. The stone now stands as a permanent public declaration that the laws of tradition were superseded by the law of self-definition. My own life immediately changed course. I rejected the traditional university path mapped out for me, and instead pursued a career in museum archival science, specifically the documentation of hidden female histories. I saw my grandmother's story as a microcosm of countless others, quiet lives of profound trauma hidden beneath perfect compliance, the tradition of a suffocating name and its accompanying duty. I look at my daughter and know she is inherently safe from the particular trauma that consumed the women before her. She has the right to choose her own path and her own purpose. I owe that simple, profound gift entirely to the woman who spent 70 years quietly stitching her true self into existence. My uncles eventually came around. They saw that the breaking of the duty did not collapse the business. In fact, the family name gained a strange, new public respect for its honesty. They never called me Isolde, but they respected the boundaries I established, a testament to the fact that power, even in old traditions, bows to genuine, uncompromising truth. I often visit the family vineyards, now run by my cousins, and I realize the land is just land. It is neither sacred nor cursed. The real inheritance was never the acreage or the name, but the quiet, profound lesson learned from the women who lived within its walls. I still keep the original leather-bound diary of Isolde, reading her meticulous entries, detailing the pain of being Eliana versus the liberation of stitching Isolde, is like reading a manual for the quiet, enduring war fought by women across centuries. It is the most valuable document I possess. My mother, Serafina, often jokes that our family lineage should no longer be defined by the traditional crest, but by a simple, carefully positioned stitch, the point of profound resistance where everything finally turned. And so, the story of Eliana, the pillar, is finished. But the story of Isolde, the true woman, lives on, not as a tragic memory, but as the quiet, defiant foundation of a new, genuinely free future for our family. My work with the museum archives did more than just preserve Isolde's story. It created a template. I developed a traveling exhibit centered around the quilt and the diary, titled The Unsewn Name, Artifacts of Female Self-Definition. This project became a voice for women across conservative traditional communities who felt the heavy weight of inherited expectations. The exhibit's main feature was a private interactive room where women could anonymously write down the name or identity they felt they were truly meant to have, but had never been allowed to use. The emotional response was overwhelming. The silent room became a powerful, therapeutic confessional. I recognized that my grandmother's trauma, the slow, decades-long erasure, was a systemic flaw, not a personal failure. By sharing her truth, we created a community of survivors. I received letters from women in their 70s and 80s who, inspired by Isolde, finally began asserting their own hidden desires in the final chapters of their lives. The local media covered the phenomenon, initially focusing on the bizarre nature of the name rebellion, but eventually shifting to the serious underlying issues of cultural obligations and mental health. The conversations Isolde started, quietly and alone in her sitting room, were now taking place loudly and publicly in town halls. One powerful moment occurred when a distant cousin, a woman who had faithfully upheld the duty in her own family, publicly stood up at a town meeting. She didn't announce a new name, but she announced that she would no longer enforce the same stifling expectations on her own granddaughters. It was a ripple effect, a true breaking of the chain. Serafina, my mother, also contributed to the legacy. Her art studio began hosting workshops for older women, using textiles and hidden needlework as a therapeutic tool for self-expression. They used thread to articulate the feelings they had been forced to suppress with silence. It was a way of healing the trauma through the very medium that had once contained it. The land remains productive, but the philosophy of the vineyard has changed. My cousins, influenced by the shifts, began diversifying their staff, promoting based on merit rather than solely on family lineage, slowly dismantling the very rigid, old-world structure that the duty was meant to preserve. I often think about Gabriel, the librarian who gave Isolde the river stone, and the name Lilia. I researched him extensively and found he became a quiet, successful professor of literature, known for championing marginalized female poets. He lived a life of quiet integrity, a mirrored existence to Isolde's, their brief, forbidden connection providing the vital spark for her long rebellion. The diary itself has become a resource for academic study, not just history, but psychology. Researchers are now using Isolde's meticulous record of internal struggle to better understand the long-term mental health effects of enforced cultural submission and generational trauma. I look at my own daughter, running freely through the vineyards, entirely unaware of the crushing weight her ancestors carried. She is growing up in a house built on love and choice, not on a suffocating, unwritten contract. That freedom is Isolde's greatest, most tangible gift. I realize that the duty was defined by fear. The fear of failure, the fear of change, and the fear of the self. Isolde's act was defined by courage. The courage to risk everything for her own soul and the souls of those who would follow. My work is not done. The next phase of the project is collecting and publishing the anonymous, unsewn names from the museum exhibit, creating a powerful collective declaration of identities suppressed by tradition. It will be a testament to the thousands of Isoldes waiting to be heard. I know that the women of my line will always carry the scar of that history, but it is no longer a wound. It is a reminder of the immense strength required to choose oneself over one's fate. That is the true, enduring inheritance. And so, the legacy of the quiet woman who stitched her truth continues to expand, proving that the most profound revolutions often begin not with a bang, but with a silent needle and a single carefully chosen name. I am Clara, and I am proud to be the voice for the woman who spent 70 years fighting to tell me, I am Isolde. My work is the living proof that the rebellion was successful. The trauma is no longer a silent, suffocating burden. It is a meticulously archived history. I developed the traveling exhibit to ensure that the fear that gripped my grandmother's generations, the fear of daring to be more than was prescribed, is systematically dismantled in every community it reaches. I still encounter women who believe the duty is inevitable, but I show them the quilt and the diary. I show them the simple, undeniable evidence that the structure they believe to be ancient and immutable was, in fact, incredibly fragile and held together only by silence and compliance. The land remains productive, but the philosophy of the vineyard has changed completely. It operates on merit and genuine innovation, not on inherited rigid roles. My cousins, running the business, finally understood that the breaking of the traditional chain did not lead to ruin, but to honest, sustainable growth. The economic stability Isolde sought to protect by wearing the lie was ultimately achieved through her truth. I often think about the profound power of that initial silent choice. Isolde chose to use the very tool of her confinement, the needlework, as the weapon of her liberation. She showed us that the greatest acts of courage are often internal, hidden from view, yet possess the power to shatter external reality. My mother, Serafina, continues her painting, her canvases a vivid, constant celebration of the freedom Isolde bought for her. When she speaks of my grandmother, there is no pity, only a deep, respectful awe for the resilience required to maintain a double life for 7 decades and still emerge whole. I look at my own daughter, running freely through the vineyards, entirely unaware of the crushing weight her ancestors carried. She is growing up in a house built on love and choice, not on a suffocating, unwritten contract. That freedom is Isolde's greatest, most tangible gift. The final victory belongs not just to Isolde, but to every woman who visits the archive and sees her own story reflected in that hidden stitch. The collective act of sharing the unsewn name has turned a personal trauma into a universal legacy of emancipation.